Hey everybody, this is Lance and Kevin at Harding School of Theology. We're here again to talk about Job and grief, and this is our last video. Today we're talking about when God talks in the divine, when it addresses Job.
And these are called the divine speeches, is that right?
Right, so there's two speeches. The first one where he talks about, all of this is about the creative world, but the first one about the seas and then the wild animals. The second speech about these two creatures, Behemoth and Leviathan.
Dinosaurs?
No.
No?
No.
Not dinosaurs? Okay. I've
we-
heard that for a long time.
And we don't have time to get into all the details, but Leviathan is a character in the ancient Near East and in Israelites' understanding, and typically associated with chaos and destruction, but I don't think so in Job 40 and 41, and I don't think so in a few other places like Psalm 104, but that's kind of not exactly our topic today.
So here's this burning question that I have. Is
Okay.
God's response to Job unfair?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's the one that I think we rightly ask of the book. God is often portrayed as somebody who comes as a bully, and he just totally ignores anything that Job has to say, and he just sort of basically says, "I'm bigger than you, get over it," right? I don't think that's an appropriate way to...
That's an interpretation of it, but not necessarily your interpretation of what happens.
Right, I also don't think God comes all lovey-dovey and just says, "It's okay, Job." He comes in a whirlwind, which is a destructive force, and yet he doesn't destroy Job.
Well, I mean, what is it that he says? What's his response?
All right, so he asks him a lot of rhetorical questions. Have you done this? Can you do this? And there is a sense of, don't you remember that I am God? But there's something in the content of the images themselves that I think does teach. He comes as a sage. I mean, this is a wisdom book. He comes, and good sages teach and counsel, and he'll even talk about how Job has darkened his counsel, advice and design. But they also rebuke. So I do think there is rebuke in this. I mean, Job has darkened God's design. He's misunderstood it and misspoken about it. And yet, we also have to hold this together with chapter 42, verse 7, where God tells Eliphaz that you haven't spoken rightly about me like my servant Job has. So there's a lot that Job says right, and I think all of that has to do with his honesty and integrity.
Well, it's really interesting because I think Job has been taken so many different ways, right? People have used it to talk about grief and suffering and, how we should respond. We shouldn't ever question God. And yet we've tackled some of that because Job does come before God and he's basically saying, why did you do this to me, right? I didn't deserve it. I want my day in court. And then the divine speech is God's response to that.
Yeah. I think he's responding in particular in the images with, and I'll try to explain this, to Job's framing of the creative world and his own place in it as God's enemy. I mean, he has taken on this kind of mantle of, you're treating me like your enemy, I'm your enemy. In chapter 7, verse 12, he'll talk about the dragons. And, am I the sea dragon that you imprison me? And so he's treating it, God, he is being treated like the wicked should be. And God...
In his mind.
Yes. And God will... he won't say, "Job, you're not my enemy," but he will say, like, the lion. Okay, the lion is an image of the wicked that God punishes. In chapter 4, Eliphaz talks about God breaking the teeth of the young lions as a metaphor for how God treats the wicked. But there's symbols of wickedness. Well, in God's speech, God feeds the lion. And it's almost like he's saying, "Job, don't talk bad about the lion."
Who is considered to be wicked.
Right, and God is saying it's not. Yeah, it has hunger, it has needs, but God is caring for these things. These marginalized beasts, to talk about the wild donkey, which is a symbol for poverty and marginalization and disgust for Job and his friends. And God says, don't talk bad about the donkey. These are creatures, yes, they're wild, and yes, they don't do any good for you, but I love them, or I care for them. So God is not a divine warrior like Job imagines him to be in relationship with these other living creatures. He is a caretaker. He's a zookeeper. There's not quite a great metaphor for this, a wildlife manager or something. But all of the images that he puts before God or before Job are images of the wild and images of danger. All of those things that oppose Job and his domestic world.
Which is like, for me, it's really frustrating.
Yeah.
To hear those frames of reference back to Job, because they're not really an answer. It's like he's just saying, hey, don't talk about people that way, or don't refer to this that way, and it's like, okay, but what about the fact that Job has experienced this horrible suffering?
Right.
Like, what are you doing to address that in this?
And God doesn't tell him why he's suffered. He never will. Right? Job never finds out it was a big test. I think, though, what he is addressing Job by talking about these wild creatures, because Job has likened himself to these things. Mm-hmm. In sort of a roundabout way, he's reframing the way that Job sees the world and his own place in it. So he is telling Job, essentially, you are not my enemy. Mm-hmm. I care about you. And yes, you might be destitute and suffer and be mistreated. But that doesn't mean that you're wicked, and it doesn't mean you're my enemy. And I think the way I describe what God is doing here, this reframing, is kind of taking if you hit your thumb with a hammer, mm-hmm. all you can do is look at your thumb and hold your thumb and cry out about your thumb. That's your only focus. And that's what naturally happens in suffering. And that's what Job has been doing. And there's nothing wrong with that. But God is trying to get him to look to the margins, like as far as he can, away from his own thumb, to these kind of the margins of the universe, even the stars and these the seas and the wild animals and Behemoth and Leviathan, all these really marginal creatures. Another way to say, sort of look over here, not to distract him, but to help him reframe his own suffering as something that it doesn't give him an explanation, but he does sort of help him to see himself as a creature that God cares about.
So I want to, as a counselor, I want to camp out there for 1 second, because I feel like it's important to say, in my opinion, that is one of the most significant things that we see in the book of Job, mm-hmm. is that God's interaction with Job doesn't necessarily give him resolution to his suffering, mm-hmm. but he expands Job's understanding of him so that his suffering can fit within a larger context. Yeah. His suffering is seated along with so many other things that God is involved with, that it provides a different perspective or a different understanding. And I think it's important to point out that we should never be seeking necessarily to totally resolve our suffering or our pain, because mm-hmm. in some ways there's nothing that will satisfy that. I think we've said that before. But if we can understand it in a larger perspective of God and who He is, then maybe it changes how we experience that suffering.
Right, it doesn't. Yeah, and I think that is what happens. Job doesn't give up on his probably his suffering or his questions. He doesn't. There's not denial of that, but there's a shifting in how he views it. Right. And not that he gets the answers, but he sees it. I've wondered about something that I have a friend who is grieved after losing her husband and mm-hmm. blogged about it, and she wrote something one time about watching her dog play and how it was sort of therapeutic. I don't know if that's the right. Sorry if I'm messing up her word, but it kind of did something here, just to watch another animal that had no concern for, her own feelings of suffering necessarily, but just enjoy. It sort of shifted that, and it actually did reflect back on her own feeling of the world. Mm-hmm. How big the world is, how the minutia of the world, big thing, and not that it's just a distraction again, but I've wondered how good it would be for somebody who was experiencing trauma you know, and the kind of enduring the length of trauma, to just go immerse oneself in the created world.
Yeah.
Whether that's binge watching the TV show Planet Earth, which I think is amazing, and can be therapeutic, just to like look at this thing that has nothing to do with you.
Sure.
It doesn't mean that God doesn't care about Job, but that seems to be what God is doing for Job.
Yeah, I mean, I think certainly something that immerses someone in God's created world, that expands our view and perspective of Him.
Yeah.
I mean, it could definitely be therapeutic.
Yeah.
It could be a distraction too, because you know, if it's just binge watching and that's what it is, to distract from the pain, then though that has its place, I don't think it would be good to do that all the time.
Right.
But I think if we immerse ourselves in something that, like Job, takes the focus solely off the pain, and gives us a broader perspective of everything around that, then the experience of us in our pain in the midst of who God is can shift.
Yeah.
And that's a really important part of grieving.
Right. And maybe this is where we should sort of try to draw this to a close, that there's something that Job experiences in the presence of God that does shift him.
Yeah.
And chapter 42, the first 6 verses are really difficult to understand, but he does have this statement that he says, I've uttered what I didn't understand, things too wonderful for me which I did not know. And he said, I had heard of you by the hearing of the ear, but now my eye has seen you. It's like this new experience of the presence of God really has changed him, and whatever he says next is really difficult, but there is some shift in Job, and that doesn't happen outside of the presence of God. That's ultimately where the book of Job kind of leads to.
And ultimately what I hope we seek to find is to have that sort of spiritual awakening in the midst of that suffering that we experience. Because it's as if God touches us in a different way than we've ever experienced before. And I do think that I have seen multiple people who have described having those kinds of experiences with God that they would not have had they not gone through their suffering.
Right.
So I'm not saying that we long for suffering so we can have those experiences, but I do think that there's a uniqueness to God reaching out and touching somebody in the midst of their pain.
Yeah. Well, good. Well, thank you for paying attention to these videos. I hope they've been helpful to you. They've been good for us, I know.
Yeah.
The Lord bless you.